calling?
One of the first thing that pops up to my mind when I see a case like this is I want to try to understand the dynamics in the economy here.
Mhm.
Why do people invest in why do they put a factory on the Mexican side of the border? Why is it interesting to work in this region here? And maybe you could start by giving me the broad picture of the dynamics in this union or in this area here.
Sure.
The border between U.S. and Mexico.
Are you familiar with the origins of the maquiladora system in Mexico?
Nope.
Nope.
Okay, then let's start there.
That was
Give
a
me a
unanimous answer here. Nope.
Just following here. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, the maquiladora system in Mexico began in 1965. It was started to be designed about 1963. The reason they designed it was in 1963. The end of the Bracero program was announced in the United States. That was 18 years after the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, there was a population boom in the United States. They call it the baby boom. And in 1963, when the first wave of the baby boomers started to graduate from high school, there was a concern that there wouldn't be enough jobs to absorb them into the labor force. So the U.S. government terminated the Bracero program, which was a guest worker program for the agricultural sector. Workers from Mexico could come up to the United States during certain seasons and do work in the farm sector. And these were in areas where it's traditionally or historically been difficult to recruit labor. And so Mexico had excess labor, the USA had a worker shortage, so it worked out very well. But this guest worker program was terminated in 1963 because of the anticipation that there was going to be an unemployment program in the United States. Well, in response, in Mexico, there was a concern that there was going to be an unemployment problem that developed on the south side of the border with farm workers that would otherwise have continued to work seasonally in the United States. So what the government decided was, let's try to attract investors from the United States and other countries eventually to set up factories in Mexico that can put to work this displaced labor that is resulting from this policy decision north of the border. Well, surprisingly, the maquiladora sector, it took off, but not in the way that the government in Mexico anticipated. The first factories were oriented towards textiles and apparel, and the most experienced workers for textiles and apparel tended to be young women, because women are the people in Latin America that, for the most part, manage sewing machines and scissors and things like that. So the first wave of workers that were recruited into these maquiladora factories were women who knew already how to work with fabric and how to cut fabric and how to sew pieces of fabric together. Then, as more and more labor-intensive manufacturing started moving into this sector because workers became more experienced and because businesses identified that there was a pool of productive labor in northern Mexico, many times they recruited females because the type of work that was being done, this assembly work essentially, required small hands that could fit into tight spaces, and they required a lot of manual dexterity that farm workers simply don't have. They're used to working, hard labor, lifting heavy things, and a lot of times their fingers and their hands simply are not agile enough to do the type of very intricate assembly work that was being done in this first generation of maquiladora factories throughout northern Mexico. Eventually, these companies became so productive that when all of the Japanese and East Asian manufacturing work started to become increasingly competitive with U.S. factories, it was identified by many companies in the United States.
Are we in the 80s here, or?
We're in the 70s still,
okay.
But it's moved on into the 80s. Many companies identified that, hey, it's no longer possible to have labor-intensive manufacturing work done in the United States simply because the wage productivity ratios are being offset by lower wage productivity ratios in East Asia, initially in Japan, but also in countries like Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and eventually other countries like Malaysia and Thailand. And so, let's see, there were successive waves of U.S. companies that, because of competitive pressures out of Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia, were forced to invest in Mexico. They didn't want to go to Mexico. They went there by economic necessity simply because of competitive pressures from companies and corporations located in Asia. As companies began doing this, eventually we reached a situation where most of the available labor for the type of work that was being conducted by these manufacturers in northern Mexico exhausted the supply of available labor, and then they started recruiting labor from other parts of Mexico. And it really caused a number of important changes in northern Mexico and in other regions of Mexico, because thousands upon thousands of workers migrated from central and southern Mexico into northern Mexican manufacturing centers, the biggest of which is Ciudad Juarez, but also into places like Chihuahua, Mexicali, Matamoros, Reynosa, Tijuana. Tijuana is the second largest maquiladora manufacturing center in all of Mexico. And the type of labor mobility that is normally associated with countries like the United States or Canada now, was being observed in a Latin American country, albeit a member of the North American Free Trade Agreement. There are a lot of interesting things happening here. In general, impressions of maquiladora factories in Western Europe and North America and high-income regions of Asia are not all that favorable. But within Mexico, workers regarded maquiladora work opportunities as something that was very favorable. In fact, in the 1980s, once the maquiladora growth wave continued to accelerate, it began very rapidly in the 1960s, intensified during the 1970s, and continued to intensify during the 1980s. Throughout northern Mexico, a number of housewives would complain that these international factories were causing all sorts of problems because you could no longer obtain domestic service. In other words, it became hard to hire maids, gardeners, and chauffeurs because the workers that normally would have filled those positions in Mexican households preferred to work, when possible, in these foreign factories. So while these multinational organizations had negative reputations outside of Mexico, within Mexico, workers were voting in their feet. Not only were they relocating geographically from other regions of Mexico, but sociologically, they were voting in favor of these multinational corporations. They preferred to have fixed work schedules and have the opportunity to work with defined benefit contracts. In other words, they knew what their wages were. They, received coverage in the Social Security system in Mexico in terms of health benefits. They had on-site cafeterias within the companies, on-site health clinics, and the working conditions were, in most cases at these factories, a lot more favorable than anything else that was competing in Mexico. And so globalization was regarded, I guess, from an anthropological perspective, very different within Mexico than what it was regarded outside of the country. And so there were a lot of interesting phenomena occurring in Mexico during this period.
This goes up to...
This growth period went up pretty much unabated, although there were, business cycle impacts that were observed. But for the most part, it was a strongly secular growth trend that was observed from 1965 up until the end of 2000. Now, two things happened in 2001 that changed the growth dynamic in the maquiladora industry. The first thing was that the Enron crisis, or the dot-com recessionary crisis in the United States, really lowered demand for a lot of manufactured items that were now being produced in Mexico. Initially, it was apparels and textiles, but then it expanded, and by 2001, there were a lot of high-tech manufacturing. A lot of high-tech manufacturing was being conducted in northern Mexico. Most of it was on the basis of intra-company trade. In other words, companies were increasingly having different components manufactured in different regions of the world. And so some manufactured in the United States, some in Western Europe, some in Eastern Asia, and some in developing countries like Mexico and other parts of Latin America, as well as Southern Asia.
Do you see Mexico as a developing country?
It's a developing country, but it's a middle-income country. Mexico is not like Bangladesh. It's not like any of the sub-Saharan African countries, with the possible exception of South Africa. It is much more advanced than most countries in Southern Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. It's not quite as advanced as, say, Korea or some of the other East Asian economies, but it's definitely more advanced than your typical low-income countries. It's a middle-income country, and it's knocking on the door of becoming an upper middle-income country. So there's a lot of development in Mexico that belies the popular image of this country.
Is it okay if I break in with questions?
Sure.
I think it's extremely interesting because you're describing an economy that has been constantly growing since, well, at least since 62, 63, 64.
Well, that segment of the economy, this export manufacturing.
But I'm just wondering if it's just been increasing since that point of time, why is Mexico still a developing country?
Well, we can talk more about that in a second, but I want to say one other thing about the 2001 downturn. The second thing that happened in 2001 that really changed the landscape for the maquiladora sector was that China had started to deregulate its economy in 1980, and by 2001, the regulatory gap that previously separated China from Mexico had been reduced substantially, and now a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing relocated out of Mexico. Some of it went to other Latin American economies like the Dominican Republic and Honduras, but a lot of it jumped over the Pacific Ocean into China. And that reduced the demand for maquiladora workers substantially. And in a lot of cases, maquiladora output has recovered what was being observed in 2000, but it has not recovered the prior employment levels. And that's because, the really labor-intensive manufacturing that previously took place in northern Mexico, that pretty much now takes place either in southern Mexico or in other parts of Latin America or mainland China. What takes place in Mexico now is more standardized manufacturing. It's much more capital intensive, and so now you have fewer maquiladora workers at most factories producing higher levels of output. Okay, you had a question that you wanted to ask me in terms of Mexico's development overall?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand why is it so that Mexico has still not moved on from the developing country it was 30, 40 years ago, and the country still a developing country it is today?
Okay, development policy in Mexico has followed a very curious and historically unique path. Geographically, Mexico is well situated. Mexico could be much more advanced than it is. However, from about 1919 up until 1989, for 7 consecutive decades, Mexican foreign policy was designed to minimize commercial and industrial and all other types of economic ties with the United States. Historically, this made sense because of bad relations between the two countries. The United States acquired large sections of land that at least nominally was under the control of the government in Mexico City. Native American tribes dispute this. They say Mexico claimed it. They actually governed it, and when the U.S. took over these lands, They really had to fight the battles, most of the battles against Native American tribes. But in terms of, let's see, the small towns that were scattered throughout this region, those were under the control of the Mexican government. And the U.S., let's see, took them away either in wars or in territorial purchases. And that left, let's see, caused lingering political problems between these two countries. Second thing that influenced these things was that a number of the companies, multinational companies that operated in Mexico, subsequent to the Mexican Revolution from 1910 up to 1919, many of these companies, let's see, really treated workers badly. In fact, they let's see, were not honest in their dealings with the government of Mexico. Now, most of these multinational companies were from the United Kingdom. After all, the British Empire was the single largest economy in the world back in those days. But if some of those companies were also from the United States. And since the United States was closer, it was regarded with greater suspicion than were a lot of companies from Europe. In fact, I think even though France, let's see, supported an invasion in the 1860s of Mexico, I think U.S. companies throughout the 20th century have been regarded with more suspicion even than the French companies, which is a little bit ironic given that it wasn't until 1865, with the support of the U.S. government, that France finally withdrew its support of Maximilian. But nevertheless, things progress historically in curious ways, and that's definitely been the case between the United States and Mexico. And so why is this important? Well, most countries fight to have greater economic linkages, both commercially and industrially, with the United States because they recognize that it creates, good business opportunities and eventually translates into higher income performance. For a 70-year period of Mexico's economic history, they tried to do the exact opposite. They wanted to minimize all commercial and industrial ties with the United States, and in fact, they succeeded to a large extent. That hampered economic development in Mexico. Beyond that, the development model in Mexico changed radically after World War I. During World War I, export markets for Mexican products in Europe, Western Europe, dried up as a consequence of the disruptions associated with World War I. Then, 10 years later, in 1929, when the stock market crashed in the United States and that eventually translated into a global depression, those same export markets dried up again. Mexico, similar to many countries in Latin America, decided it needed to become self-sufficient. International trade was simply too unreliable. It couldn't rely on its markets either in North America or Western Europe. And as a consequence of that, they decided to embark upon programs such as infant industry industrialization and import substitution industrialization that ultimately ended up being disastrous, were not successful, wasted a lot of resources, and carried along with them a lot of government intervention into the domestic economy and further exacerbated the problem of misallocated resources. And so Mexico did not progress as a consequence of those three policy errors nearly as much as it should have. And only after the debt crisis of 1982 did it start to liberalize its international trade relationships with the rest of the world. And only after the earthquake of 1985, December 1985, did it start to begin to consider how to deregulate its economy. That accelerated in 1989 as a consequence of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is really what convinced Mexico to seriously begin deregulating its domestic economy.
The Berlin Wall?
Yes, and that's because at the time everybody said, okay, the Berlin Wall has been torn down, the Warsaw Pact is collapsing. All of the investment that might have come to Latin America under prior circumstances is now going to be diverted into Eastern Europe. And as a consequence of this, Latin American governments need to do something, because otherwise, Latin America is no longer going to be attractive in terms of bringing in direct foreign investment. And so that's when Mexico seriously began deregulating its economy and allowing the private sector to operate more efficiently. It's been a long struggle. In the 23 intervening years, most of the market-oriented reform measures have come only as an outcome of very protracted political battles. And eventually, improvements were made, but it was very begrudgingly, and it was at a very slow pace. And even though private sectors have bad reputations, the fact is that governments tend to make worse resource allocation mistakes than do private sector companies. And so, in Latin America, a lot of times, the effort was devoted towards having governments manage industrial and commercial sectors of the economy, when what governments really should be doing is managing sort of public service sectors of the economy. And by the way, having governments manage what they rightfully should manage, that's extremely difficult. Having them manage industrial and commercial segments of the economies, that almost always proves disastrous. And that's not something unique to Mexico or Latin America.
I think we've seen that also in our part of the world.
Yeah, it's something that's observed in Africa, Asia, as well as parts of Europe.
But how do you see the Mexican economy today? Because if I take a look at the Mexican economy, one of the first thing that strikes me is it's extremely attractive to foreign direct investments. If you take a look at the entire Latin America,
and the reason that it's attractive to foreign direct investment is because geographically it's so close to the United States, and politically, there are a lot of vehicles in place, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, that allow companies that operate in Mexico to have preferential access to the U.S. market, and so that helps as well. In terms of where the Mexican economy is currently, it's more advanced than most developing economies. It's one of only 3 developing economies that are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And in the context of 2012, just last month, the single most important structural reform measure in the history of the Mexican economy was approved, and that was a far-ranging labor code reform measure. In the old days, up until 2012, when analysts look at the labor market in Mexico, they used to say that the Mexican economy suffers from an Aztec strain of Eurosclerosis. You look at many of the large economies in Western Europe. The most prominent example of this is the German economy. And the labor codes there are nominally designed to protect worker rights. What they end up doing is making the private sector shy away from increasing their payrolls whenever possible. Probably the worst example of this is the Spanish economy, where the unemployment rate typically or historically has averaged more than 20% per year for extended periods of time. And that's a consequence of the worker rights that were provided under these sclerotic labor codes. Mexico had its own version of that. In fact, all of Latin America has versions of this. It's not something that is unique to Mexico. It's something that is shared by labor codes throughout the region. But it's ironic because you have the one economy in North America that enjoys ample labor resources, but private sector companies tried to avoid increasing their payrolls whenever possible. Didn't make sense, but it was a consequence of this labor code that was nominally designed to protect worker rights. That labor code has been completely overhauled, and the labor code that has just been adopted in Mexico is going to raise Mexico up to international standards. It should increase eventually. It's got to get implemented.
In terms of wages, workers' wages, or when you say international standards, you mean in terms of?
And I mean in terms of the manner in which companies can operate and can hire labor. Okay, Mexico is now joining, maybe not the 21st century, but at least it's joining the 20th century. And once this new labor code gets implemented, and that may take a while, but once this labor code is implemented, the demand for labor in Mexico should increase substantially. In fact, it's probably going to have a downward impact on the flow of migrant workers out of Mexico into the United States. And eventually, the debate in the United States is not going to be over how to treat immigrants. The debate is eventually probably going to turn towards how do we recruit additional labor from Mexico, or do we simply allow larger numbers of laborers to come in from other countries where labor codes have not been modernized. So modernizing the labor code in Mexico is going to eventually improve labor market performance in Mexico. That's going to translate, just a second, that's going to translate into greater demand for workers in Mexico, and it'll eventually, as a consequence of more jobs being created, it should also raise wage levels. And as these workers become more and more experienced, they will also become more and more productive. And as productivity increases, just like it has done in other regions of the world, as that worker productivity increases, that's going to translate into better income performance.
Okay. I'm still trying to understand, because if we take a look at China, I'm not saying that China is a benchmark here. Rising wages means lower competitive power for a country like China. How would you compare that to Mexico?
Well, in terms of
reforms,
sure, and in fact, we observed that 12 years ago in Mexico when a lot of companies migrated out of Mexico into China. Wages were high enough. It wasn't wages in isolation. It was wages relative to productivity levels. And once that those ratios turned in favor of China, a lot of companies moved over to China, especially as it continued to reduce internal red tape and made it easier for foreign companies to operate there. So it's something that will fluctuate in the future, just as it has fluctuated in the past. As wages rise in Mexico, well, that will not mean that certain segments of the economy are immune to the laws of international manufacturing and the laws of economics. We'll see companies to remain competitive, will have to monitor, not only wages but productivity levels. But in general, as workers become more productive, their wages go up, their income levels go up, and they deserve it because they are producing more. And as companies produce more, they can sell more as well. Or they can sell at more competitive prices and increase market share, even if overall industrial activity remains, at the same level. So it's like a three-dimensional chess game. There's a lot of things going on in terms of what happens with economic growth and economic dynamics, but by allowing its domestic economy to operate more efficiently, living standards in Mexico are going to improve. How soon that occurs depends on how quickly this new labor law gets implemented. How efficiently the government institutions are at enforcing the new labor code provisions. But eventually, Mexico will probably reap more benefits from its labor code modernization than it has ever reaped from the North American Free Trade Agreement or joining the World Trade Organization. Mexico joined WTO in 1989. And of course, NAFTA wasn't approved by Canada, the United States, and Mexico until 1994. So globalization began in Mexico in earnest 5 years in advance of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But that agreement served as a catalyst to additional direct foreign investment, because so many companies regarded it as a signal that, hey, this is not just a short-term policy posture of Mexico. It really is internationally oriented now. It's export oriented now. Well, now in terms of its labor market, Mexico is also trying to operate efficiently, not only internationally, but also domestically. And whenever countries have done that historically, it's always translated into better standards of living. So a lot of economists and policy analysts are very excited about what's going to be observed in Mexico over the next decade.
Okay, but what do you see as a major threat to this development? Because we're here to discuss unions, maybe not with you, but with the companies that we invest in. What do you see as a threat of the development in Mexico now and the years to come? Because you're talking about labor codes and
Sure.
unions are, must play a part in this development of the labor codes.
Ironically, the problem in Mexico has not really been that the unions had a lack of power. In the United States in the 19th century, work conditions were terrible for laborers, and so unions played a very important role. Well, at this point in the 21st century in Mexico, unions are sort of playing the role that they played in the United States during the 1970s and the 1980s. They are largely making companies in Mexico less competitive than they otherwise would be. In fact, they're making the entire economy less competitive than it otherwise would be. And let's see.
How?
Well, okay.
I can guess, but I would rather hear you.
Sure. They are nominally protecting worker rights, but they are also preventing companies from operating as efficiently as they otherwise could be. And these companies are not competitive in terms of quality or prices, and to a large extent product variety, as are other companies operating in economies where labor can be utilized more flexibly. And as a consequence of that, production in Mexico is lower than it otherwise could be. Wages are lower than they otherwise could be in Mexico. But the unions are trying to force wages up during a period when production is lower than it otherwise could be, and sales are lower than they otherwise could be. And they are making it difficult for companies to respond to international competition. And as a consequence of that, the demand for labor has always been at less than full capacity in terms of Mexican labor resources. And so ultimately, the problem in Mexico has not just been unemployment, it's been underemployment as well. And companies are reluctant to hire workers. Workers have to work in the informal sector of the economy. And they don't receive the type of benefits that they would receive in the formal sector. They don't receive the type of legal protections that they otherwise could receive in the formal sector. And businesses have problems operating because they don't have access to capital if they operate in the informal sector. And it causes problems for the public sector because if companies are not registered and they're operating informally, guess what? They're also not paying the full amount of taxes that they would otherwise face. And so investment in education, health, and infrastructure lags behind where it should be. And it worsens economic performance for the economy as a whole, not just the private sector.
What is the solution to that? Because we as international investors, we believe that it will strengthen the long-term competitiveness of a company if it live up to these international norms. An international norm, that is labor rights. But if the three biggest unions, umbrella unions in Mexico, they're not working the way that they should be working, they're corrupt, and I can give a number of examples. How do you see that paradox? We want them to work with the unions, but the unions are sometimes working against the companies.
Yeah. And in terms of, and I'm not a union expert in Mexico, but in terms of union corruption in Mexico, this has been a problem for some time. It was institutionalized under the Revolutionary Party Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI is its acronym in Spanish. And so it always had a lot of political power and was able to operate in manners that unions in other parts of the world have never been able to operate. It benefited union members, but that's not the same as benefiting labor in general. And so, access to jobs in the petroleum sector in Mexico, for instance, required that workers make certain types of payments to important union managers or union executives in order to get a job. And then they could get added to the payroll of Pemex, but it was very difficult to do, very expensive to do. It didn't really benefit the workers, especially while they're paying off those fee requirements. And then, eventually it made Pemex operate very inefficiently as well. Now, Pemex is probably the most extreme example of how unions have hurt economic performance in Mexico. But, the energy sector is very large in Mexico, and so it's a very important example to cite. In terms of the existing unions in Mexico, it's not clear that they have really had worker benefits as their core focus. Unions in Mexico historically have watched out for union political power, for economic benefits associated with upper management of these unions, but really haven't benefited workers in a manner that the workers really deserved. And so there are some unions in Mexico that actually serve a useful purpose. Other unions in Mexico have the type of reputations that you just indicated in your question. And so, in terms of what happens in 2013 and beyond, some unions will continue to operate very well in Mexico and serve a useful purpose in terms of improving work conditions at factories and at businesses in Mexico. Others are probably going to see their influence recede because companies in Mexico will be able to hire workers that are not unionized perhaps. They will also be able to, in those circumstances where union participation is involved in their day-to-day activities, be able to work with unions that have not been associated with the type of practices and norms that developed, over the post-war economic history of Mexico.
But I heard another story that I would like your view on. I heard that some of the American unions, and heard stories about that some of the American unions, especially the steelworker union, they wanted to push up wages in the Mexican area to keep jobs in America or in the U.S.
Yes, internationally, a lot of unions in high-income countries, have viewed Mexico with a lot of suspicion because wages are lower than in Mexico. I think it's important to point out that if you have a worker in Mexico that makes 10 times less than a worker in the United States, that doesn't necessarily mean that company should relocate to Mexico. Because if the worker in the United States is also 10 times more productive than the worker in Mexico, well, you're paying that worker 10 times more, he's producing 10 times as much, there's no incentive to relocate into another country. However, when the wage to productivity ratio is higher in the high income country than it is in the low income country, then there's a strong incentive to relocate because you're paying less, but in comparative terms, receiving more output, receiving more bang for the buck as we receive in the United States. So it's only under that circumstance that companies have incentives to relocate. In fact, really, it's more that they have international competitive pressures to relocate, because guess what? If a company is paying workers higher wages in the United States, but their productivity levels are not proportionately higher than what they are in Mexico or other developing countries, there's probably going to be an international company, whether it's a Korean company or a Japanese company or an Australian company, that's producing the same product, but it's producing it in countries with lower wages and productivity measures that are in line with it, and they're going to be able to produce at lower prices, and they're going to drive the U.S. company out of business.
So
it's those
both
competitive.
countries outperformed.
Yeah, the competitive pressures are what drive all of this. By reducing union powers in certain industries in Mexico, it's probably going to benefit that industry as a whole, even though the unions lose membership and lose influence. Labor unions are going to serve a useful purpose in Mexico. Ironically, it's probably the unions that don't have very much power now who are going to serve the most useful purposes as we move into this new post-2012 era.
But are they allowed to do that?
Nobody really knows what's going to emerge. How this labor law gets implemented is going to be critically important. And at this point, in all honesty, there's probably no guarantees with regard to any single aspect of that labor code, with one exception. Temporary workers are going to be able to be hired more often in Mexico. That almost everybody agrees is the case. And so if the existing unions maintain their same level of influence that they now enjoy, then probably what will occur is that instead of hiring full-time union labor, what is going to occur is that companies are going to increasingly hire part-time non-unionized labor. That's not going to be a good outcome, but it's still going to be a superior condition to what is currently observed throughout industry in Mexico. And it's probably going to represent a step in the right direction for labor in general in Mexico. It just means that labor will not obtain as many gains as they should if the law is fully implemented, and if the stranglehold that some labor unions in Mexico currently hold over industry in general, if that stranglehold gets broken, then we're going to see additional benefits accrue to labor that currently are not accruing.
Okay, enough with unions. Well, it is interesting, I have to say that. But what do you see as other threats and opportunities for the Mexican economy now and for foreign direct investments in Mexico?
The biggest question right now is, how is this labor law going to be implemented? If it gets fully implemented, that is going to accelerate economic expansion within Mexico. There's other questions as well. One is, how is the government going to operate over the course of the next 6 years? The past 12 years have seen an increase in public sector transparency that has never been observed throughout the entire 200-year history of Mexico. Mexico is barely 200 years old, and the past 12 years has observed the type of public sector transparency that has never previously been observed within Mexico. So now you observe the type of information in Mexico. You have access to the type of information in Mexico that is normally associated only with other countries within the OECD. You can obtain the type of data in Mexico that you can obtain in Canada or Germany, or pick your country, Switzerland. Pick whichever country in the OECD you want. Mexico now has developed a comparable level in terms of the type of economic information collected over periods of time, so it can be monitored and it can be utilized, in terms of examining whether economic performance statistically mirrors what's observed in other countries.
Is that something that can limit the level of corruption in Mexico?
Definitely, because now government budgets can be examined. Government expenditures can be examined. and government revenue flows can be examined, not only at the national level, but also at the state level as well as at the municipal level. And so the type of public sector transparency that is normally associated with Western Europe, Japan, and North America has now, jumped the Rio Grande into Mexico, and it has been a major change in terms of, how analysts can examine investment opportunities south of the border. I say south of the border, but really it's internationally, because multinational corporations from Europe and Asia are also doing the same things that multinational corporations from Canada and the United States are doing. That wouldn't be possible without the type of economic transparency and government transparency that currently exists in Mexico. And so type of things that were essentially state secrets are now open to the light of day, and it has accelerated direct foreign investment. And nobody knows if the new president and the PRI in Congress is going to continue to maintain that level of transparency. Some of it is mandated by the multilateral agencies, but not all of it has been mandated by the multilateral agencies. Some of it's been encouraged by the OECD. Some of it has simply been in response to what's been observed internationally. Whether this continues, that's a big question, and it's one that has a lot of downside risk associated with it. If Mexico steps back, that is going to discourage the type of investment that has been observed in recent years in Mexico. Another area where there are concerns is, what is Mexico going to do in terms of its energy sector? Its energy sector right now is not open to foreign investment. Historically, it's easy to see why that's the case. You know, the British oil companies, and to a lesser extent the United States oil companies that operated in Mexico between 1914 and 1939 really did not have a good track record in terms of corporate citizenship within the country. However, I think it's useful to point out that domestic corporations within Mexico didn't have particularly good corporate citizenship records within the country. The difference was, at least they were homegrown. These international companies from the United States and the United Kingdom, they were different, and they caused, Mexico to nationalize the oil industry in 1939. That was, something that was a major stepping stone in terms of forging Mexican national identity. Well, now it's become also a millstone around the neck of the Mexican economy, because the oil sector in Mexico is so much less productive than what it is elsewhere in the world. And it is, as a consequence of bloated payrolls, as a consequence of, low levels of profitability, Pemex has not reinvested in either production techniques or exploration the way that it should have. A lot of oil fields in Mexico are producing less than they should be, and their potential lifetimes are becoming more reduced than what they otherwise would be, because investment is so far below what is optimal. And so this is going to be something that, the labor sector is now becoming much more modernized. It's coming up at least to 20th century levels of efficiency. The energy sector still lags far behind. Eventually, the growth impact of labor code modernization is going to wear out, and if it's not accompanied or complemented by improvements in terms of the energy sector, that segment of the economy is going to cause more problems than it already does. Give you an example of those problems. Mexico is an oil exporter. Everybody recognizes this. What people don't recognize is that Mexico is a gasoline importer. It consumes more gasoline and more diesel than it produces. It is one of the largest oil exporters in the world, but it's also one of the largest gasoline and diesel importers in the entire world, and that's because of energy sector mismanagement. Mexico should be exporting gasoline to the United States. Instead, the United States, in spite of all the regulatory constraints that prevent new refinery capacity from being developed or new refineries, factory sites from being developed, the United States is still, because of the efficiency of private sector oil companies, able to export to Mexico, and it profits enormously from that. Mexican consumers are paying higher gasoline prices than they otherwise would have if that domestic refinery capacity existed within the country. Under the current energy sector laws, it's not possible for Pemex to develop that refinery capacity, and it's not possible to bring in the international expertise and the international capital resources required to develop that refinery capacity. This problem is going to continue to worsen. It's going to become more exacerbated. Let me answer this call. I'm sure it's my wife.